Welcome back to the deep dive. We're jumping into a really interesting area today, exploring a concept that seems to pop up a lot, in discussions about movies, TV shows, even books sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
It's that feeling you might get when a character, they don't quite feel like they belong to the story itself. Maybe more like they belong to the writer.
Absolutely. It's a critique you hear more and more often summed up with that term, self-insert.
Right.
And it's a key point in the material you shared for this deep dive,
Right.
Especially highlighted in that YouTube video transcript we looked at.
Exactly. That transcript and the other notes and things you sent over really got us thinking. So our mission today, basically, is to unpack what exactly a self-insert character is. Why does some of this material suggest it's become such a notable issue in current media?
And then walk through some specific examples that really stood out across what you gave us.
Yeah. So, okay, you've probably heard the term, but what does it really mean when someone calls a character a self-insert?
Well, the core idea, at least as presented in the material, is actually pretty straightforward.
Okay, let's break it down then. One perspective in the source defines it as when a writer projects their own, really specific politics, or their personality quirks, their personal viewpoint, maybe their sexuality, even personal struggles.
Yeah.
Pretty directly onto a character in the story.
And the result, according to that view, is the character can start to feel less like an individual, crafted for that specific narrative.
Right.
And more like a direct, maybe sometimes even a bit jarring representation of the person holding the pen or, typing on the keyboard.
Now, it's important to acknowledge the nuance here. Some of the material does touch on it.
Definitely.
It's not saying that any time a writer draws on their own life, it's automatically bad. Not at all.
No, absolutely not. Writing what you know, that can be the source of some really authentic, really interesting characters. We've seen it loads of times.
Exactly. Powerful characters often come from lived experience.
Yeah.
But the material you shared seems to focus heavily on why the modern use of self-insert often has this kind of negative vibe.
Yeah. And one strong critique that comes through is that it's often seen as being done, lazily or maybe egotistically, and often at the expense of the actual story.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though. The material suggests audiences are actually pretty sharp about this. One point made is that maybe, 90% of the time, audiences can just feel it when a character seems like a self-insert that isn't quite meshing with the story.
Yeah, they can sniff it out, apparently. And if we look at the motivations behind what the material calls these problematic self-inserts, they point to things like a writer feeling, I have a message, or I have an agenda, or even just, I need people to know more about me through this character.
Right.
And this perspective argues, look, those motivations don't automatically line up with making great content, The goal is usually to entertain or educate or inform. And those personal motivations don't by themselves guarantee good storytelling. They don't justify it necessarily.
And it doesn't sound like the material sees this as just a one-off thing either. It suggests self-inserts are, quote, pretty prevalent right now.
Which, naturally leads us to the examples. That video transcript you mentioned really singles out several cases where this critique gets applied, gives us something concrete to look at.
Okay, first up, the Disney Plus She-Hulk series. The video points out that the writers themselves apparently admitted basing Jennifer Walters quite a bit on themselves.
Right, and according to that critique in the video, that's sort of where the problem started.
How so?
Well, instead of the fun, kind of zesty, fourth wall breaking She-Hulk from the comics, the character in this view came across as, and these are the words, shallow, petty, smug, and bitter.
Oof, okay. And the critique in the video goes further, right?
Yeah.
Arguing the story arcs felt too focused on her love life.
Yeah, her relationship troubles, and that characters often seem condescending, especially towards male characters. It was described as feeling more like self-insert fan fiction than a proper superhero story, basically questioning if She-Hulk was the right place for, venting those specific personal issues.
Got it. Okay. Another example they discussed was the Velma animated series.
Mindy Kaling's Velma.
Right. And the perspective in the video there was that the show felt almost like the Mindy Project 2.0.
Yeah, that's the comparison they made. Like, Mindy Kaling was inserting her exact tastes, her personality, her humor, her life experiences directly onto Velma.
And the criticism there, it sounds like, framed it as writer ego.
Pretty much, resulting in a story that felt to them preachy and inorganic. And the argument was this approach didn't show much love or respect for Velma's 30 or 40-year history, her established personality and motivation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The viewpoint in that source is pretty blunt.
Yeah.
If a writer wants to do that, wants to project themselves so direct,
they should make a new show.
Exactly. Create a new cartoon. Don't just take over an existing beloved one.
Okay, moving on then. The material also brings up Star Wars, specifically the sequel trilogy and Rey.
Ah, yes, Rey. Now, here, the video transcript is careful to state it's a suspicion, right? It's not confirmed fact.
Good point. Not confirmed. But the suspicion is that Rey might be a self-insert for Kathleen Kennedy.
That's the idea floated, yeah. And the metaphor used in that particular critique is pretty vivid.
What was it?
Something like brunette girl boss pushing her way through a challenging narrative, besting and overshadowing every single man she encounters.
It's a strong take from that source.
It's definitely strong. And the core problem that perspective sees with that kind of perceived authorial attachment is what? Refusing feedback.
That seems to be the main concern raised, yeah. That when creators feel a character is so much theirs, they might be way less likely to listen to fan criticism.
Even if things aren't working, like merchandise not selling. Right. The argument is they might just buckle down and stick with it because, in their head, here, this one is me. Shut up, take it, buy the toy.
Okay. That's
pointed. It is. Then the material brings up another example, one that seemed more personal for the video's creator, Lightning McQueen in Cars 3.
Ah, interesting. How is he seen as a self-insert?
Well, the suspected connection, according to this perspective, is to the real-world situation with John Lasseter leaving Pixar. Being, kind of pushed out by younger talent. The video suggests this is mirrored in the film by Lightning McQueen, the aging champ, being effectively replaced by the newer high-tech cars after his big crash.
So the film becomes a metaphor for the creator's own experience.
That's the critique. The video actually calls it John Lasseter's healing sequel.
Wow.
Noting how McQueen is shown, failing at literally everything, and even gets beaten by his trainer, Cruz Ramirez. They even point out her name having a diverse origin.
So the argument is it's less about Lightning's journey.
Exactly. Less about the 7-time champ we knew and more like Pixar holding up a mirror to themselves. The character becomes a literal and figurative vehicle for the studio's or a writer's personal story, or maybe reflecting on what was happening at the studio, the story serving the creator, not the character.
Okay. That's a really different angle.
Okay.
And finally, there was a concern raised about an upcoming movie, James Gunn's Superman.
Yeah, this was more of a pre-release worry expressed in the material about Crypto, Superman's dog.
Crypto the Superdog. What's the issue there?
Well, the specific point raised is that this Crypto is apparently based on James Gunn's own dog, a dog he recently adopted who was formerly abused, a bit misbehaving, a terrier type.
Okay. How's that different from usual?
It's quite different from the classic Crypto, who's usually depicted as more of a noble Labrador type in the comics and cartoons.
Gotcha. So the worry is?
The worry expressed is this dog going to be a meaningful character within the Superman story? Or is it more of a, quote, quirky pet gag shoehorned in for James Gunn's own self-indulgence?
This perspective questions if that choice creates a weird tonal clash.
Yeah.
A potentially chaotic dog next to a Superman who's meant to embody hope, strength, legacy, integrity.
Right, the tone.
And it critiques the idea that creators can just sort of make up lore later to justify a choice like that.
Okay, so looking across all these examples and the broader point, what's the overall negative impact the material sees with these perceived self-inserts?
Well, it seems to boil down to a few things.
Yeah.
One key takeaway is that in this view, these kinds of self-inserts can end up flattening what could be more complex characters.
Okay.
And they can also take away time and space from other characters who might have shown if they'd been developed more independently.
So it sounds like the main argument is prioritizing the writer's ego, maybe?
Yeah.
Or their personal message over the actual story and the audience.
That's pretty much the core argument presented in the material, yeah.
Yeah.
When that happens, it's the audience who ultimately loses out. And there's this fascinating point, too, about connection. The material suggests if a character feels too tied to a writer's super specific personal stuff that the audience just doesn't know or relate to, it can make that character feel insufferable or just unrelatable. Is that right?
That's exactly the point made, that crucial connection you want the audience to have with a character. It gets broken.
Interesting. And the material contrasts this with classic characters, doesn't it? Like Superman, Batman.
Spider-Man, Luke Skywalker.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those enduring figures.
And the distinction being made there is that those characters were crafted for the story.
Right, crafted for the audience at large, crafted to support a major narrative. That's the view presented. They work as players inside the world.
Instead of being reflections of the writer.
Yeah, rather than characters perceived as being mainly in and for the writer's self-image.
It raises a big question then. The goal, according to this perspective, should be characters that serve a real purpose to the audience by being real in the story, not just being you, the writer.
Precisely. Not just transplanting yourself onto the page or...
Okay. So, bringing it all together, what does this all mean for you listening right now as you dive in?
Well, it really highlights that tricky balance, doesn't it? That tightrope a creator walks.
Yeah.
On one hand, you've got the power of drawing on personal experience to make things feel authentic. That can be amazing.
But on the other hand,
there's that potential pitfall where a character becomes maybe too direct, a self-insert, a problematic one that actually pulls away from the story and stops the audience from connecting.
So maybe something to think about as you watch that next show or read that next book or see that new movie.
Yeah, maybe ask yourself, do these characters feel like they truly belong to the world, to the story being told?
Or based on what you're seeing, do they feel maybe more like a deliberate reflection, perhaps even a specific statement from the person who created them?
And what does that observation tell you about the story itself and how it's being presented? It's definitely something to chew on.